Welcome back to Nate the Hate, where I am once again joined by everyone's favorite Australian mate, MVG.
What's up, Nate? Great to be here.
Always great to have you. And today we have a topic that you and I really want to give the in-depth attention that it really deserves, and that is crunch time in the video game industry, because this is a topic we have seen come up several times over the last few years, particularly with games like Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, a little bit with Cyberpunk, and it's come up once again with Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2, which is slated to come out in just a few weeks in mid-May. And this all spurred because there was an article on Kotaku last week from Jason Schreier, where he interviewed some of the developers at Naughty Dog, and they expressed, I guess you would say, dissatisfaction with the way management at Naughty Dog has handled the development of The Last of Us Part 2, and they cited a lot of crunch hours. And you had one of the lead animators, Jonathan Cooper, come out on Twitter to say, even though he didn't experience a lot of crunch himself, he did see it in other departments. And he went as far as basically attacking management, saying that they hired a lot of junior engineers, and had Naughty Dog had more senior staff, they probably could have released the game last year. And that's a pretty damning, accusation, because Naughty Dog is that prestigious studio for Sony. And to come with an accusation like that has kind of left people feeling a bit mixed in his overall statements, though he does have some validity to what he was saying. So what's your reaction to that?
Let's not forget Neil Druckmann's clapback as well.
Yeah, like right after those tweets came out, like the following day, he comes back like, we have some great animation in The Last of Us Part 2. And yeah, you're right, you do, because you had one of the best animators in the industry, Jonathan Cooper, working on the game. And like immediately Druckmann was there to spin it and like, we're a great studio, everybody. Like, good job.
So my thoughts on this, Nate, this is very complex for me. This is not a cut and dry discussion. And it's going to be a couple of things that I'm going to say that you may not agree with, and that's fine. I mean, we've always said that this is a healthy discussion, not an argument or a disagreement. And I think that there may be some points that I bring that you may not, agree with, or the listeners may not. But the first thing I'm going to say is Schreier's article was a bit of a hit piece on this, and you may not agree with that. But the way that I kind of see this is that crunch is one of those things that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people and companies. There are some companies that kind of embrace crunch as part of their culture, and I know that doesn't sound very good, and I'll get into some examples, as we talk through this. And that it also can be a very negative thing, and that is people burn out, they don't know what to do, they end up quitting their jobs and going elsewhere and really having a bad experience. And there are other folks that kind of ride things out in the hopes that things will get better, or they'll get promoted, or they'll get offered a full-time position, so that carrot gets dangled in front of them to, if you stick around, we'll get you where you need to be. So just, work these long hours for now, but we promise you that things will get better. That type of mentality, which I think is very bad. Yeah. And I'll explain that as well. But for me, look, man, this is Naughty Dog. They've made some of the best games ever, and I kind of compare this to the kind of analogy about the best albums in music history. The people that wrote these like legendary rock albums or legendary R&B records, they didn't come in to work or to the studio at 9 o'clock and punch out at 5 and say, hey, good job. They worked all night on this stuff. They busted their ass. They went above and beyond. And I think Naughty Dog has the same kind of mentality. We make some of the best games in the industry. We have to work above and beyond just a regular 9 to 5 in order to succeed. And I think there's a lot of people that work there that really believe that, and they're on board with that approach. But the sad, unfortunate part is that ultimately the article was written in such a way that really kind of outlined and illustrated the the number of, I'll say, contract junior employees that were brought in to really kind of address the problem of the lateness of the game being delayed. But as we both know, I mean, those types of things don't really happen. So a lot of different things to kind of digest there. It's not a cut and dry thing. And, you know, for me, I'm not surprised when Naughty Dog is crunching on a game, or I'm not surprised if CD Projekt Red is crunching on the game. These guys make some of the best games in video games, and it really takes a mammoth effort in order to get there. And so, you know, for Schreier to make that article, I didn't really feel like it really brought to light anything that wasn't that obvious in the first place. And I just kind of felt like he was just, you know, doing an expose on something that, in my mind, didn't really need to be discussed. But I also do agree with the issue of there is definitely a management, you know, problem there at Naughty Dog.
Right. I mean, we've seen over the years, I mean, it's typically the articles do come from Jason Schreier, whether it was about CD Projekt Red or Rockstar with their recent games. He's the one to really put that spotlight on crunch in the industry. And I remember reading articles dating back as far as 2007 on Naughty Dog and crunch within the studio, because they lost a lot of their development staff during the development of Uncharted 1 for the PlayStation 3, because the game, it was a technical nightmare. They were having a lot of issues, and they had a mass exodus of employees almost leading up to launch. I think it was only about 6 months out from the release of the game. They were losing employees almost every day because of the strenuous work environment that was going on at the studio. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm not an advocate for crunch in a development studio. And like, you use the music reference for, you know, some of the rock stars coming in. And I think my main rebuttal to that topic would be, if I'm a music star, or even, you know, I'll say YouTube, if I'm personally crunching for the project I have passion for, at least it's my choice. I'm not being told by a superior that I have to come in, work 9 to midnight. I have that freedom to say, I'm pulling an all-nighter, I'm working the next 36 hours straight on this project, because I have the passion for it, and it's made at my own volition. Which, I mean, that actually, we saw that happen today with the Doom creative director. Hugo Martin came out, and he said in an interview that to him, it's not really crunch. Mm-hmm. And he goes on to say, this is going to sound hokey, but to him, it's a lifestyle. He lives and breathes this. And he said, no one makes me stay at the office. Even when I come home, I see my kids, I do my thing, and then I just do research. The research is playing video games, reading comic books. It's all part of his ambition to engross himself in pop culture that he can then take and put into the video game. So for him, it seems like he goes to work, he comes home, and it's always on his mind. It's his passion. He doesn't mind if he's working a 70-hour work week. Whereas, as you kind of brought up the contract worker, they signed, you know, maybe a 36-month contract with Naughty Dog. And if I'm there working a 70-hour week, even, you know, for half those 30 months, at the end of those 30 months, most contract employees are released. They're terminated from the contract, and they have to go to a new studio for a new job. So I could see them, they're getting burned out. They're not really feeling wanted, or even they're not getting adequately, I guess, credit for the work they do. So once that job is over, it's over. They have to find something else. Now, if I'm a full-time employee, I have my benefits. Ideally, I'm getting paid by the hour so I can get some overtime. But if I'm on a salary, you know, you're still going to face those burnouts. And when a project has too many employees who are suffering from burnout, the end result is going to show that. You're not going to have the passion for the project anymore.
Yeah.
And I mean, those are the dangers of crunch. But then, as like Martin put in his interview, he doesn't view it as crunch. He just views it as, it's a lifestyle.
That's a good point. You know, like, let's use me as an example. I've worked in IT for many, many years, and I've been in the situation where I've led development teams, and I've led, you know, 20 plus developers on projects. And I can tell you from experience that, you know, you have to take care of your employees. If you don't, if you if you bring in some contractors, and I've done this before, if you bring in contractors, you have to make them feel like they're part of the team. You have to put them under your wing. They have to be mentored, and they have to understand and get up to speed on how the business works, how for them to be successful in the work that they're trying to get done, and really just, make them assimilate into your work environment without making them fail. I mean, your job is to make your people, as a manager, your job is to make your team successful, because that makes you successful as a manager. And then when it's time for you as a manager to get a review at the end of the year, you did a great job because you successfully led these people to do great things. And it sounds like from what we're hearing that Naughty Dog did not, or has not let that, has not made that happen in some instances with their juniors and the contractors they brought in. And really, I think that's kind of the root cause here of why this has become what it is because they haven't really got the appropriate kind of mentorship program in place to help these juniors grow, or if they do, maybe they're just too busy and no one really has the time to help them, do their work or get them up to speed anyway. I'm not really sure which one it is, but it doesn't really matter which one it is at the end of the day. I mean, either way, anyone that you bring in is going to have to fend for themselves. Now, some people, some juniors or some people, contractors you bring in, they're really smart people, and they'll bug people and ask the right questions and get the answers they need in order to get what they need done. But a lot of them won't. And really, again, it goes back to management that's really kind of failed these people. And I think, if Shirai's article outlined anything, it's that, management really needs to take a look at themselves and the way that they handle these things, because bringing in, we'll say 20 junior developers to boost a timeline and get things over the line so you don't have to delay the game again. I mean, that's never going to work. That is that's kind of a rookie move. It's a desperate move to kind of appease your manager or your executive that, hey, we're bringing in more people to get this project done. Everything's fine. Don't panic. We're on schedule. But it rarely works out that way because, like I said, that those folks will need, the appropriate training and guidance for that to actually happen. And that is, in of itself, takes some time to accomplish.
Right. That's kind of my takeaway from the Schreier article, was that it seems as though Naughty Dog wasn't really incubating new or even old talent well within the studio, because in the Cooper thread on Twitter, he was saying a lot of senior staff had left during the development of the game over the last couple of years, and that they basically were bringing on just junior bodies to fill those roles. But while they were training the juniors to fill the role necessary, they were also trying to advance in work. So as you said, you have to train them. So even if I have to train them 4 to 6 weeks, at the same time during those 4 to 6 weeks, I'm also trying to make progress on the game. So now what normally could have been actually 6 weeks of progress on the game with a senior staff member, now we probably only made maybe 2 to 3 weeks of progress because I'm also training, I have more people. So you can't just throw bodies at the situation. And it also sounded like Naughty Dog extended their vision of the game because they were bringing on more junior engineers and programmers. And instead of just staying at that 100-yard finish, they said, why don't we go for 120 yards now because we have more people? And that's poor management decision. You should stick to your original vision, your original goal, and set out to achieve that. You don't add to it just because you have more bodies working on the project.
Yeah, that's because that's very dangerous if they do that. I mean, why not just bring out a DLC after the fact? With the kind of the extras that they were thinking about doing.
Exactly. And I mean, the weird thing with the Schreier article, or any interview or expose you'll ever see online or in print, is that it's always easier to get a disgruntled former employee to talk than a happy employee.
Yep.
Because a disgruntled one may have a personal vendetta. They're going to air their grievances. more openly because at that point they have no loyalty to the company. Now, that's not to say that their, grievances are necessarily wrong. They are they are worth what they're worth. They are enlightening. They give light to the topic. And I mean, I don't think Cooper in any way is a disgruntled employee. I think he left Naughty Dog on good terms. You can look through his Twitter timeline where he praised working there. He loved working at Naughty Dog for, I believe it was 5 years until he finally left. But something set him off where he did not like the direction of the studio or how he was being treated there anymore. That caused him to, leave the studio. So sometimes what we do see, like in the Schreier articles, it is honesty. Mm-hmm. They are just simply, they're disappointed with, what happened to the studio they had a passion for. And it almost sounded like maybe Naughty Dog was taking advantage of juniors who their dream job was to work for Naughty Dog. And they knew they would do anything to work for them. And, part of that anything was you're working 65 hours for the next, for the week for the next 8 months.
But it was never asked of them, right? It was implied, it was,
right. You do this, right. You're going to look good to, Druckmann or, whoever. You're going to look good to the management. And when we're done, we're going to remember you did this.
Yep. And we'll offer you a position, or we may offer you a position.
Yeah. It kind of, it lights the fire under your ass to hopefully get more productivity out of you. But you're chasing the canary in the coal mine, hoping there's light at the end of that tunnel. But then the game might ship and they might say, thanks, here's your pink slip, bye.
It sounds like The Last of Us 2 is Naughty Dog's most ambitious, biggest project that they've ever done, at least from a timeline perspective. It seems like this game has been in development for years, and it's obviously just over a month away, and I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be an excellent game. I've already been reading about how the insiders are considering this their best game, and I have no reason to not believe that. I loved the first Last of Us game, so I think this will be excellent. Where does Naughty Dog go from here after The Last of Us Part 2? Because PlayStation 5's around the corner. There's going to be questions asked, what's Naughty Dog going to do for the next generation? Are they going to pick up Uncharted? The question really is, do they learn anything from this development life cycle with The Last of Us 2? Do they take a good hard look at themselves and say, okay, we can't afford to do what we did over the last 5 years because it cost us really good employees and people that left the company, as well as it cost us a delay in the game. So how do we alleviate these things? What do you think they do anything different this time, or do you think they'll just kind of do what's familiar to them and just continue with the way that they've been going?
That is a great question. And I think they keep the status quo, because as much as these articles come out about crunch, and you will see gamers go to forums and Twitter and say, I'm not going to buy The Last of Us Part 2 or Red Dead Redemption 2 or whatever game that the crunch article exposes, the masses, at the end of the day, they don't care. They're going to buy the game. They're going to sell millions of copies. And I think if I'm a company like Naughty Dog, what I'm doing is it's legal. And as long as it's legal, why should I change my practices from a business perspective? Like I'm losing talent, but I'm also bringing in new, fresh talent from ambitious young college graduates who want to make a name for themselves. And that well, you're going to milk that dry if you have to. You're always going to find new talent. You're going to hire from other studios by offering them lucrative contracts. So I don't think anyone is necessarily going to look at this one instance and learn from it. I think the only way we really see change is if the industry itself forces it on them, where you see bigger developers and even publishers come out and say, we're cracking down on crunch time to do this. We're going to limit our developers 40 hours a week. We're basically they have to unionize, and I'm not sure if the gaming industry is at this point in this day is ready for that, because I mean, we've seen it in other industries like the automobile industry. You unionized and the companies took a lot of work overseas, and China is a up and coming market for, and they're doing a lot of asset work for numerous studios. You send out whatever you can to those studios, and China is happy to take those contracts, and they will produce for you. They will work 100 hours a week if that's what you demand of them to get that contract done. And even if they keep the work here, we've said for years, $60 is undervaluing the games that come out, which is why we saw the rise of microtransactions and downloadable content, because the Last of Us Part 2 is worth far more than $60. But is the industry ready to pay $80 or $100 for that game? And right now, my answer would be no. I don't think anyone's willing to drop $100 on a single PS4 or even PlayStation 5 game.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there's no multiplayer in this one, right? They said that?
Right. It's just a single player game. They came out early on saying we weren't doing multiplayer. It wasn't part of our vision at the time. I think they implied that it was going to be something that they were looking to in the future as a possible, I guess you would say, a downloadable add-on, but it's nothing that we have seen or heard of since that initial statement.
I was doing a video on Doom for my YouTube channel this week, and I was doing some research on the original Doom that came out in 1993, and there was one little quote or article that I read that really got me interested, especially it's relevant for this topic, and I'll read it out to you. It says, Doom's original release date was at the third quarter of 1993, which the team did not meet. By December 1993, the team was working non-stop on the game, with several employees sleeping at the office. Programmer Dave Taylor claimed that working on the game gave him such a rush that he would pass out from the intensity. ID Software, or id Software, began receiving calls from people interested in the game or angry that it had missed the planned release date. At midnight on December 10th, 1993, after working for 30 hours straight, the development team at id uploaded the first episode of the game to the internet. So, my question to you, Nate, is crunch is not something that is new. It's always been there, and crunch is something that exists in every single work environment you'll ever be involved with. Like, it doesn't matter what line of work you're in. There will be a point where you'll work more hours than is that you normally do. There's something that happens where you have to just work longer hours to get the work done, or you risk losing your job. Why are we so interested in crunch in kind of 2020, 2019? With kind of these AAA games, when this is something that's clearly been going on, and I'll just use the Doom example, or video games, pretty much since the beginning?
That's a tough question too, and I mean it brings up an interesting point, because when I was younger, I worked as a laborer on a construction site. My father was an engineer, and the summer that I was the laborer, we were reaching the end of the project. So we had a punch list, and we had to hit a certain date. We had to have everything done by a certain date. And the punch list, it's mostly menial things, but it was, it could have been, you have to finish, installing the doors, checking the water systems, all stuff like that. But it took a lot of time. And it didn't matter if I'd go to work at 5 o'clock in the morning. Typically, I should have punched out at around 4 o'clock. There were days I was there 5 to 10 o'clock. And I mean, that by definition was crunch. And that typically went on for a couple of weeks because, I mean, jobs fall behind because, you have bad weather, you can't do certain construction work. And I mean, I guess it's standard in a lot of industries, but because it's standard, does that make it right? Does that make it, okay to exist?
Right.
I think that's like the bigger question. Like, just because it's standard practice doesn't mean it is acceptable.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's acceptable. Don't get me wrong.
Right,
My,
right.
my point is, these articles that keep coming out, they're enlightening. They're kind of interesting to get a little look inside the inner workings of the company. But is it really surprising? I mean, the only kind of, I mean, even indie studios, right? I mean, indie studios are small, they're lean, they're lightweight, they get things done. They usually will hit their targets. But look, you can't tell me that an indie studio that's trying to meet a deadline isn't crunching, the last couple of weeks to get things done. I think it's a part of the industry, and it's fine to bring these articles out. But like you said, Nate, I mean, I think unless something drastically changes, I don't really see this being something that goes away anytime soon. I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of exposés come out. And I think that, honestly, it's not something that can be solved. I mean, I think it's really just, it's a part of the culture almost. And I hate to say that because, that's not something that I necessarily agree with, but I think it's really something that we just are going to assume is happening in most game developers out there.
Right. I think one aspect that is leading to a lot of the recent articles about like this topic is, I think some people, they finally realize that there's a lot of CEOs, it's these bigger publishers that seem to be exploiting the hard work of all those employees. Like we see Activision CEO Bobby Kotick. Bobby Kotick makes something like in the range of $30 million a year. He's not a developer, he's a businessman. And then we see Activision lay off 1,500 people because they had a slow quarter. Mm-hmm. But you still sold 20 million copies of Call of Duty. And I think it's that capitalistic disconnect I think people are seeing now where that's not right. When this industry was new and it was young in the 80s, early 90s, where it really started up and coming, where you had Carmack and that team make Doom. It was a group of scrappy, rambunctious kids.
Yeah.
Making their passion project where they weren't filed by the business men in suits saying, we're going to crunch the numbers and we're going to pay you low wages, demand numerous hours of work so we can reap the benefits of your hard effort. I think that's kind of why we see this topic come up a little more. I mean, CD Projekt Red, we know they have crunch. We really don't have a full idea of how they treat their employees, wages, benefits, and all of that. Because we have seen the budgets of some of their games, and their budgets are incredibly low compared to what we see from most Western studios. And then, I mean, I'll use Call of Duty as another example. Call of Duty has how many studios working on it at any given time? I think it's like 5.
5, maybe 6.
Yeah, and it'd be like Neversoft. It's like all these companies that Activision acquired who were previously known for other genres, like the Tony Hawk series. All of a sudden, they're making multiplayer maps. And they have thousands of people working on these games. And all of a sudden, it just sells a little below expectation. And Activision's there with the axe to shut down a studio.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we see a lot more of these exposés on crunch and the working conditions for especially Western developers. Because I don't want to necessarily throw a company like Naughty Dog under the bus and not bring to light how it is an industry-wide problem. Even though Nintendo came out and said, we're delaying Animal Crossing due to crunch or to avoid crunch. Crunch is also a very real thing in Japan because Japan does pride itself on kind of like the honor system. I mean, we've seen Nintendo's own Sakurai. He's gone to the gym and passed out from exhaustion because he's working on Smash Brothers. Now, I mean, I can come back to he's choosing to work on that himself. He's working himself to the bone. If he chooses that for himself and it's not being dictated to him, who am I to say it's wrong?
Right.
And that's, I mean, I think that is kind of that's where we're kind of at. Like, I'll even go back to Hugo Martin with his work on Doom Eternal. If to him it's a lifestyle, if it's something he lives and breathes, if he loves having the game on his mind 24/7, as long as he's not being told by management that you have to do this, I'm in no position to say he's incorrect to feel that way. I'm also in no position to say the junior employee who's being told to work 75 hours a week for the next 4 months is wrong to feel burnt out.
Yeah. The thing about Hugo is Hugo Martin, you said? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know how old that dude is, but let's ask him again in 10 years after, he's shipped a couple more games, whether he still feels the same way. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. What I'm saying is, Doom Eternal right now is a hot commodity, but there's going to be the next game that is going to take X number of years to build. And then there's going to be the game after that. Are you still going to feel the same way about your role, in a couple of years after a couple more games have been shipped? You're still going to have that excitement, or are you going to still feel like, maybe it's time I scale things back a little bit and stop working ludicrous hours at night? Because I've worked with developers before that, man, they write code at 2 a.m. because that's what they want to do. They love doing that. No one's asking them to do that. It's like, hey, after midnight, I've got my headphones on and I'm writing code till like 4 a.m. That's great, buddy, but that's not something that I'm interested in. And I think it goes back to what you said. Crunch can be okay for some people because they kind of live the lifestyle of crunch, but some of us don't really subscribe to that. And I think a lot of the juniors at Naughty Dog certainly didn't.
Now, like, what would you say is what is the necessary action from a consumer if you don't support crunch in the industry and you have a release like The Last of Us Part 2 coming up? Like, what would you tell the consumer who doesn't want to support that? Because, I mean, as I said on the Spawncast over the weekend, every company on the earth is exploiting somebody in some way, whether it is to get precious earth minerals,
yes,
the backbones of just workers for shipping, of anything. Every company is exploiting somebody. But in the case of like a video game, I guess you could say it's a little more transparent, especially when you have articles like this come out. If you want to show respect to the worker and you want to boycott the game, or you just like, what's the best way to show support to those developers who have had to crunch? Would you say you boycott the game, you buy it used, or do you still buy the game new because you want to? By buying the game, you're showing that I appreciate all the effort you did put into this.
Well, first of all, let's forget about boycotts because they never work. I mean,
Pokemon.
I mean, Pokemon got boycotted. I'm saying that in air quotes, and look how many copies it sold and how many millions it made. Boycotts don't mean anything. They don't work. Honestly, I mean, I think there's different ways to communicate your feelings and opinions to the the company. And I'm not saying get on Twitter and start sending Neil Druckmann nasty tweets. I do think that there is a way to relay your concerns about something in a kind of typical fashion. But honestly, man, short of not buying the game, there's not really anything else, and everyone's still going to buy the game anyway. So it's a very, very difficult one. I mean, Schreier's article was definitely enlightening, and it did ruffle Druckmann's feathers. I mean, he did respond, albeit in a very interesting way, basically beating his chest and saying, we make the best games in the world, and I'm proud of the team. And sure, I mean, that's what you're going to say as the head of the company or head of the studio. But how do you kind of stop it without kind of boycotting? That's a real difficult one to answer because, I've been waiting for that game for many years. You have. We're both going to play it. It's going to sell millions and millions of copies. No one's going to boycott the game, even though there is a issue with management at that company. It's really just, I don't know, man. Like that's one I really don't know the answer to. I think there's some things that we could probably think about trying to do, but at the end of the day, it's going to sell a bunch of copies, and a couple of years from now, or even 6 months from now, after the game has been released, no one's going to remember the crunch. Everyone's going to remember how amazing the game is, and it's going to be up for a game of the year, contender and stuff like that.
Right. I mean, as soon as Red Dead Redemption 2 released, nobody remembered the crunch article. No one remembered the stories of how workers were not being valued or treated well. It was, the game's out, and that was the end of that discussion, which, I mean, I guess that kind of speaks to the gaming community as, a whole. The community has a short-term memory. It's news today, it's forgotten tomorrow, which, I mean, I think that's not just, limited to the video game industry or the video game community. It's a societal problem where our attention spans and us holding an interest in a topic just fades very quickly. So what do you think the industry, I think within the next 10 years, the industry undergoes a major shift in the means that game development is handled in the Western areas between America and especially Europe. I do think we see developers try to unionize, and we will see some companies who will just come out and put new work practices in place, definitely within the next 10 years. What do you see happening for the industry to combat this problem and to change the status quo? Or do you think certain CEOs and the heads of these companies are going to resist for as long as possible until you have that one company kind of come into place, and then you're going to have that domino effect?
I think they're going to resist, and I hate to say it. I just feel like, there's been success with these games as far as making money, so much money on these games that why change it, and even if you want to change it, is it even possible? Like, back to Naughty Dog, if you read the Schreier article, they talked about how when they started The Last of Us 2, they were ahead of the game. They already did a lot of things early on, and they kind of set themselves up for, to do less hours, or to do regular hours, I should say, as the project kind of went through its life cycle. But to your point, they started adding scope and features, and it really kind of blew things out. And then, people started to get disgruntled and start to leave. So, I don't think it's that much needs to change. I mean, unionizing, sure, that may be something that happens, but it really goes back to management, man. Like, one of the things I read about Naughty Dog is that they kind of don't have a production team. They deliberately don't have production teams, and the reason why is because they want their developers to be creative. And usually, if they're creative and it gets okayed by Druckmann, then the creative thing that they've done usually gets into the game. So they really want to get their people being creative and making sure that they do the best they can. And I kind of respect that, but I mean, for God's sake, man, you don't have a production team at Naughty Dog. That to me, that sounds like that's what the root cause of the problem is right there. Because the production team is supposed to be, the team that kind of glues and keeps all the different cross-functional teams together. You've got your artists, you got your coders, you got your engine programmers, you've got your animators, you got your VFX people. I mean, all these teams are supposed to be kind of synchronizing with each other and getting things done. And that's what a production team will do. I mean, that's what their role is. Their role is to have their finger on the pulse of the project. If there's any issues, that they raise them immediately with upper management, and it really helps the project run its course. And they're the ones that are ultimately on the hook for we're on track, or we're maybe a couple of weeks behind. They're the ones that kind of report status to the kind of the executives, or the Druckmanns of the world as well. So why wouldn't they have a production team, or project management, or whatever you want to call it? And I think for Naughty Dog, that type of approach has worked for them for such a long time because they've made some amazing games. But, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, we need to unionize, but really take a look at your management structure again, and maybe, you know, put more emphasis on good management before you know, try anything else. Because I think once you have a good management structure in place, then things tend to fall into place a lot better. And I'm not saying that it's going to be, you know, completely on track for, you know, getting your game out on the first release date that you had planned. But if something's going to slip, then usually those things are understood and identified very quickly, so things can change, you know, appropriately with the amount of resources or whatever you need to do. Maybe you need to cut some scope from the project, you know, just bring it back a little bit, you know, or not. And I think at the end of the day, getting a good management structure is the most important thing that they can do. And certainly, you know, these other companies that we've heard of as well with, you know, with excessive crunch, I think that's really the key thing.
So not to make this exclusive about Naughty Dog, who would you pin more blame of crunch on? The publisher or the developer? Because we know publishers set sometimes unrealistic release dates. And the developer is sitting there saying, well, we have to get the game out in 24 months because they announced the release date at E3. So we have to get the game out, let's say, you know, May of 2020. We have 2 years. Now we fall behind. It's not the developer obviously relayed some information to the publisher to say, this is what we're targeting. But as we've seen with someone like George R.R. Martin, he can't hit a publication date with a book, even if he gives you a decade. He delays his books, you know, pretty much religiously.
Yeah.
So who would you pin more of the blame for crunch on, the publisher or the developer in some cases?
I think it goes both ways. It really depends. You know, sure, I mean, I think if the publisher sets unrealistic expectations or deadlines on when they want the game, that is obviously something that would be blamed or put on the publisher. But I also feel like, you know, the developer needs to put their hand up and say, look, that's just not possible. We can't do that. And here are the reasons why. I mean, I think if you come back to the table with some good, you know, solid timelines and some solid technical, you know, breakdown of cost and time, and it's something that's kind of unrefutable, then I think that's okay. And maybe these developers are saying, oh, we can do that. You know, we're going to have to push hard. It's an aggressive timeline, but we can get there. So then does that fall on, does the problem then kind of, or the blame get shifted to the developer for basically taking on that work? It's not a cut and dry thing, Nate. I think honestly, both parties would share some of the blame in that regard. I mean, we don't know what the original dates were for some of these things, right? Or we don't know what discussions went on, and we're not just talking about Naughty Dog, but in general about, you know, what the publishers are expecting. But I think if the publishers want something, we'll say by Christmas, and the developers saying, oh, we got to push hard, you know, we got to bring some more bodies on, but we can make it work. I mean, you better damn well, you know, be sure that you have the appropriate, you know, contingency in place to make that happen. Or, you know, you haven't factored in that people are going to be working 60-hour weeks to get there. And again, it goes back to just that poor management that I talked about, where, you know, it's like, yeah, we can do that, but you don't really consider the individual. You don't consider people and their personal feelings on the matter. It's really just more of a resource thing rather than a people thing, and that's where it gets very, very dangerous. And I think that's where things break down ultimately.
Right. I mean, I can see some developers, you know, will use like a movie tie-in because, you know, that's contract work. It's, hey, we want you to make a Black Widow game, and they say we want it out by the holiday, or even, you know, a tie-in with the movie release. And often those developers, I mean, those games usually are not high quality. And the reason for that is you typically, you know, you churn them out in about 24 to 30 months. And I mean, that's a risky situation because I, as the developer, I want that contract. I'm going to promise you I'm going to hit that date. If I say I might need an extra 3 months, I'm probably not getting that contract. But I mean, that's hopefully you do have proper management who does relay accurate information to the publisher who's seeking, to make that type of contract deal. But like I was just looking at The Last of Us Part 2, and it was originally dated for February 21st of 2020, and within weeks, it was delayed until May. So to me, that February 21st date never should have been announced because they were never hitting that.
It's like a placeholder almost.
Yeah,
like when Amazon puts a release date on
right.
a game that that it's not even real.
So like, why did Sony and Naughty Dog even communicate to each other that that February 21st was even possible? It clearly was not, because they delayed that, I think, less than 10 days after they announced the date.
Yeah.
So it was almost like they were just like, we haven't given an update on this game in a while. We have to give a general idea. What's the earliest you guys think you could have the game done? February. Mm-hmm. And then Sony took their internalized, penciled in release date and said, okay, we're going to announce it. And then they're like, you know what, guys, we just announced it. Never mind. We're definitely not hitting that. Like, that didn't do any favors for the situation of crunch, because they came out and said, oh, we need more time. We're not crunching. We just need a few more weeks to really polish out all those bugs. And then we find out you've been crunching for months.
Yeah.
So like, they really, if you just don't announce that date, you go silent, you announced the May 29th date as the only date, you may have gotten a little understanding from the community, but that looks like it's another example of poor management. It's either Naughty Dog was misleading Sony, or Sony was like, we're dating your game, we're tired of waiting type of situation.
Yeah. And I don't know if we'll ever know the answer, to that one. That's an interesting
right.
one. Did Sony really just run with a date that they were told without really spending the time to get some good information on whether that was realistic or not? Or did Naughty Dog just give them a date and say, here you go, we think we can get this done? Either way you look at it, it doesn't look good. It's very, very, very obvious that date was never going to make it.
Right, and I mean that's disturbing, because like as you were saying, internally, release dates, or at least release windows, are always penciled in, and those penciled in dates always change. What is true, on Monday is probably no longer accurate come Friday with internalized release dates. Because, I mean, we even saw it with Nintendo when they had to delay Metroid Prime 4 early last year. Internally they had a release date probably penned in for the holiday of 2020 for that game. And then all of a sudden they're saying we're starting development completely over, this time with Retro Studios. Well, now that internal release date means nothing. They planned probably up to early 2021 in terms of games in the pipeline. And now that's a huge hole. You can't just sit there and go to, I'll say the Mario team, say, we need your next game ready for holiday 2020, because development doesn't work like that. You can't just speed up a game, a 12-month cycle. You just have a void. And it's weird to me that it seems like Sony they just seem to be dilly-dallying, or Naughty Dog was over-promising and under-delivering, because in development we have milestones. And every time you usually hit a milestone, the developer gets a payout or a reward of some type from the publisher. And those are usually as incentives to keep, morale high. When The Last of Us Part 2 got delayed, they had to have missed a milestone almost immediately.
Yes.
And that's where it's just bewildering how a release date gets announced and immediately changes. Like, what did you deliver to Sony where they sat there and said, we have to delay this game? Or what did Naughty Dog relay to Sony and just say, we have to delay it? Like, look at what we showed you. It's not ready. Because, I mean, no publisher wants to come out and date a game and immediately delay it. because that looks bad on you as a company.
After Red Dead Redemption came out, do you remember when Ubisoft came out and said that Assassin's Creed Odyssey was built without crunch, and they were very proud of that?
Yep.
What did you make of that as far as what they said? Because they basically came out and said, you know, we can deliver a game without burning out. And, you know, since then, obviously, they've delayed a lot of stuff, and they've been pretty quiet, you know, and we expect them to come out this year with some new titles, well, the titles I was supposed to come out with a couple of years ago. But do you think their approach to this is the right approach, where you basically just say, look, we're not going to make the date on these games, guys. We'll return when we're ready to announce. And they've been pretty quiet for a while. Do you think that's the way that Naughty Dog should approach, you know, their games as far as delays and target dates?
I think ultimately Ubisoft has the right idea. I mean, they kind of fumbled it because they had announced so many games at that point, and then all of a sudden, like, we were only a few months away from Watch Dogs 3 release date, when they were like, we're delaying it a full year. Like, so you were never hitting your original release with that. And then we had the that mythical game, was it Gods and Monsters?
Gods and Monsters, yeah.
That was supposed to come out now, and that is delayed until later in the year. And then you have the Assassin's Creed. I think had they not given any type of release expectation for those games, and they said, we're taking our time, the games are ready when they're ready, that is a good business practice. It's kind of what we see from Nintendo. Mm-hmm. Nintendo very rarely, these days at least, announce a game well in advance only to delay it. Like, we saw it with Animal Crossing. We also saw it with Fire Emblem. And they do try to avoid that. And they avoid it by announcing games usually within about a 6-month window. So reveal to release, it's about 6 months, maybe a little longer in some cases, sometimes significantly less. Like we saw Ring Fit Adventure, I believe it was announced only about 6 weeks before it actually launched. And I like that idea from a consumer standpoint, where it's announced and it's almost immediately coming out. So that hype level is basically running through that whole time leading to release, and you can't wait to get the game. Then to have a game announced like The Last of Us Part 2, and then, or even Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it's announced 4 years, 5 years in advance, and you wait, you get an update, you wait, it's delayed, you get an update, it's delayed. I don't see how that is good for really anybody involved. But I guess what we run the risk of, if we do this silent path that Ubisoft seems to basically be embracing now, is that if we're waiting, in some cases for smaller companies, if we have to wait 4, 5, 6 years for a new game, I don't know how the industry and the audience responds to that much silence.
Yeah.
And I think that can be dangerous, because if it seems like there's nothing coming out for long stretches of time, what do you do to offset that? Like, if Naughty Dog's next game, let's say they don't announce it until 8 months before it comes out, people are going to wonder for 5 years what they're doing. And we see that now with Nintendo, and prior to Metroid Prime 4, people wondered, what is Retro Studios doing?
But what if it was 5 years of working 9 to 5 and not crunching on the game? Would that make people feel any better?
I think the consumer who is invested in caring about this topic would feel better about it. And
what about the rabid PlayStation fanboy, though? They won't care.
Right. They won't care. And I would hope that the health and happiness and morale of the employees working at the studios feel better about that, saying, I go to work, I do 9 to 5, it's a 40-hour week. Yeah, it's going to take 5, 6 years for my game to come out, but I'm not being overworked. I'm not being stressed out. I'm not to the point of depression because I just cannot take the stress of work anymore. And I think we're at that interesting crossroad where, will the community and audience care enough to see the health and safety of the employees be taken care of over their needs of a hype trailer and that constant flow of information to keep them excited. Like, I think, like, personally, if a developer is silent for 5 years and that's because they're working 9 to 5 and they're a happy studio and they're putting passion and love into the project, and I just don't hear of your game until it's 10 months out from release, I'm fine with that. I don't need to see a logo of a game in 2020 that's not coming out to 2025. Announce your game in 2025. That's fine. I mean, we have a lot of indie studios today. There's always a game coming out. We have, if anything, we have too many games coming out in a given year, where a lot are, they fly under the radar. People don't even notice them because we're always looking forward to that next big game. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff in this industry that we can still love if maybe we're not always blinded by the neon light of the next big thing.
Yeah.
But also, if I'm a console manufacturer, I'll say the next Halo game after Halo Infinite, if that's going to take 6 years to come out, is my Series X even going to be on shelves at that point?
Right. That's a great point. I mean, if you take too much time, you run the risk of missing that generation altogether and onto the next one. And all of a sudden you're behind the 8 ball because you don't even know what the next generation is, and you don't know what you're building towards as far as the target hardware.
Right. So, I mean, in summary, what would you say is, in your opinion, the best course of action for the industry in terms of like the health and care of their employees, in terms of development cycles at this point?
I think for me, it's get a good management structure in place in general is the key. If you have a bunch of yes men in middle management, then get rid of them. Find managers that truly embrace their employees, and I mean both contractors and full-time people, even part-time people that work, X number of hours a week. It doesn't matter. If you're a part of the team, you're working on the project in whatever capacity, you're a part of that team, and you should have a manager or a management structure that supports you in what you do. And I think for me, if any of this is the missing link, it's get a solid management foundation in place, get people that genuinely are about people, not about deliverables and deadlines. Empower your workers to do the best they can and reward them appropriately. Pay them what they deserve to be paid, reward them when they do good things, and really genuinely make them a part of the team, not just a body that's working on VFX that no one cares about, that ends up leaving after a couple of months. So yeah, get a solid management structure in place, and I think things will kind of work themselves out. Now that's a little simplified, but I mean, that's probably the first thing that I would look for. And I think if you go and look at any of these kind of employees that have left companies due to crunch, it's always been, my manager said I have to stay back and work on this, or the expectation from management was we had to do this. It always leads back to, your superiors or their superiors. And I think get the right folks in place, and I think the problem will ultimately, solve itself.
Yep, that's nicely put. And with that, we have come to the end of this week's Nate the Hate. Once again, I thank MVG for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's always great to have you on. And for everyone listening, if you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a dislike. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and I will give them a read. And forever and always, continue to embrace the hate.